Hello, everyone. Today we're going to continue talking about the Cold War and specifically alliances, President Kennedy, and Cuba. So we're going to begin with something called the Berlin Airlift. In 1948, Communist Soviet Union surrounded the democratic city of West Berlin, preventing it from getting any supplies. The United States and democratic countries responded by flying supplies into West Berlin. So you remember after World War II, East Germany became communist under Soviet rule, and West Germany became democratic. But they did the same thing to the capital city, but the city is surrounded by East Germany, and what the Soviet Union did is they blocked it. They didn't allow anything to come inside. You can't drive into it. New trains were allowed. People weren't allowed to leave. So essentially, people here didn't have food. They didn't have supplies. So the U.S. and other democratic countries, they got planes, and they simply just flew in and they dropped off supplies. And eventually, the Soviet Union kind of gave up with the blockade. And this led to the creation of NATO. So in response to the events associated with the Berlin airlift, NATO was formed as a defensive alliance among the US and Western Europe, so democratic countries. And NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization and was designed to prevent a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. So the Soviet Union is all of this red right here, and the green is NATO. So NATO was built because they wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from attacking any of these countries. And this led to the creation of the Warsaw Pact. So after the creation of NATO, the Soviet Union had several countries in Eastern Europe formed the Warsaw Pact, which was also a defensive alliance. And for nearly 50 years, both sides maintained large military forces facing each other in Europe. So if you go here, the red is the Warsaw Pact countries, the green are the NATO countries, and for 50 years they had large militaries just right next to each other. Luckily, they never went to war. But the red is the Warsaw Pact because red is also known as the color of communism, and the green are NATO countries. And NATO also went to Greenland, Canada, United States, and I believe that's French New Guinea was also a NATO country in South America. We're going to talk about the election of President John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election. He is still the youngest person to ever be elected to that office. He was 42 years old. He's the youngest president ever. And he continued the policy of containment, which is containing communism, which was used by his predecessors, Truman and Eisenhower. So Truman created the Truman Doctrine, which was to contain communism. We weren't going to attack communist countries, but we were not going to allow communism to spread. And Kennedy continued that, just like President Eisenhower before him did that. So he wasn't going to allow communism to spread. And President Kennedy pledged in his inaugural address that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to ensure the survival and success of liberty. So he would fight to save democracy in other countries. He also has a famous saying in which he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Unfortunately, President Kennedy was assassinated, which means killed, in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. He was in a car with his wife, and someone from a building had a gun and shot him, and he was killed from the bullet wound. Now we're going to talk about communism in Cuba. Cuba was another site where Cold War confrontation occurred, and Fidel Castro led a communist revolution that took over Cuba in the late 1950s. Many Cubans fled to Florida and later attempted to invade Cuba and overthrow it. Overthrow means to get rid of Castro with the support of the CIA. So this is Fidel Castro over here. When he led the revolution in Cuba, a lot of people didn't like it and they left Cuba. And they specifically went to Florida. So many Cubans fled to Florida and later attempted to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro with the support of the American CIA. CIA is like a type of police that the United States has. And essentially, what happened is a lot of people that were Cubans that were living in Florida, the American government gave them weapons and they told them to go fight in Cuba. However, this invasion, called the Bay of Pigs, failed and strengthened Castro's position in Cuba as well as the country's ties with the Soviet Union. So this invasion didn't work. One thing with this, it was not Americans fighting this war. It was Cubans who fled the country. The U.S. gave them weapons and they tried to get them to take over Cuba, but the U.S. didn't fight it. These were all Cubans in exile. And as a result, hostilities between the United States and Cuba/Soviet Union increased, and this would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So now we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in 1962, the Soviet Union stationed missiles in Cuba, instigating the Cuban Missile Crisis. So these are missiles right here. You can put atomic bombs on them, and Cuba is very close to the United States. So President Kennedy ordered the Soviets to remove their missiles and instituted a naval blockade of Cuba. And a blockade is where you don't allow anything in. And as Soviet ships approached, the U.S. put boats around Cuba so that the Soviet boats would not be able to reach Cuba. So this is Cuba right here. And it's very close to Florida. So if they had an atomic bomb, it would be very easy for them to drop it off and bomb it. And this picture right here is actually showing the Bay of Pigs. So the Cubans went to Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. They tried to go to Cuba and take over. However, it didn't work. And so we're back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the blockade included a barrier line in which the United States would fire if a Soviet Union ship crossed it. And this would have caused World War III. Soviet ships never crossed the line, and World War III never happened. For several days, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Eventually, the Soviet leadership ordered the removal of the missiles from Cuba. So Cuba had missiles inside of it that were given to them from the Soviet Union. They're both communists, so they're helping each other out. And the U.S. got a bunch of boats, and they surrounded Cuba. And as the Soviet Union was coming by with more weapons, the U.S. said, if you come inside the circle, we're going to fire at you, and we're going to shoot, we're going to go to war. But luckily, the Soviet Union, as they got close, they decided they didn't want to do it, and they went back to their country, and Cuba had to give back the missiles to the Soviet Union. But this scared a lot of Americans because, like I said, Florida is very close to Cuba. They were afraid that they can fire an atomic bomb, but the weapons were removed, and luckily World War III never happened. If you guys have any questions, let me know. That's it for this lesson.